Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and I am very happy to welcome to this program well-known history podcaster Mike Duncan back to the program. Mike Duncan's podcast series includes the history of Rome, and currently he is working on a series called Revolutions, which chronicles the world's revolutions from the American to the Russian one. He is the author of the book The Storm Before the Storm, which tells the story of the long decline of the Roman Republic. He joined us to talk about that several years ago. And his latest book, which is now just out, is called Hero of Two Worlds, The Marquis de Lafayette in the Age of Revolution. Mike Duncan, thank you so much for taking this time to join us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And Lafayette, there are many Lafayettes, cities that are named after Lafayette. We have a Lafayette here in the Bay Area, but I suspect most people don't know a lot about the Marquis de Lafayette.
Yeah, I mean, everybody knows the name Lafayette because you can't really grow up in America without growing up near a Lafayette Street, a Lafayette Boulevard, a Lafayette Park, you're in the county of Lafayette. And all of that comes from he did this one tour in 1824 and 1825 when he was sort of an aging legend and a living link to the American War of Independence. Like after sort of the original founding generation had died off, he came back and was a memory of that. So when he went around, like every town he showed up and they're like, we're going to name this building after you. We're going to name this street after you. And so even though all of that was really happening like east of the Mississippi, because the United States hasn't grown that much, that sort of naming nomenclature carries on. And so, yeah, even Washington, Alaska, I'm sure somewhere you go to Hawaii and there's going to be a Lafayette something there.
I did not realize that. That's how a lot of the cities, at least on the eastern portion of the country, got their names when you did a tour.
Definitely. Yeah,
it was many years after the revolution.
From like an 18-month tour he went on. He just dropping his name wherever he went.
Yeah. Now, was this book, The Hero of Two Worlds, born out of the series of podcasts that you did on the American and French revolutions, considering he was one of those people who was very much involved in both?
Yeah, and not just, I did a series on the American Revolution, and then I moved on and did a series on the French Revolution. But I then went on to do a series on the Haitian Revolution. I did a long series on Spanish American independence that was kind of happening in that same time, the 18 teens and 1820s. And then the French Revolution of 1830 was the sixth series that I did. And Lafayette showed up at some point in every single one of those series, right? He was just sort of everywhere and connected to everyone in this very tumultuous and very important period in world history, like in European and Atlantic history. But it winds up, because of how much Europe has sort of spawned its way into global domination, that this period, this revolutionary period between about 1775 and like 1825, 1830, becomes very important to world history. And Lafayette is right in the thick of all of it. So my interest in him comes from, yes, he's sort of a young teenager who runs away from home to join the Continental Army. And it's a very fun story. And then he goes back to the French Revolution and is a major player in the early days of the French Revolution before getting sort of kicked out. He runs away from an arrest warrant because they were ultimately going to chop his head off, as happened to many people who were involved in the early days of the French Revolution. But then as I kept reading, I find him in correspondence with Simon Bolivar. Bolivar looked up to him. They were writing letters to each other. He's in correspondence with the president of Free Haiti after the Haitian Revolution. And then he's a major player in the French Revolution of 1830, which is the overthrow of the restored Bourbon monarchy, which becomes a bit obscure French history, but it's still a very big deal over there. So it's like he was just everywhere in the Revolutions podcast for many seasons. He's by far the person who has shown up the most over the course of the show. And so when it became time to, The Storm Before the Storm came out and people liked it and people bought it, and the publisher said, what do you want to do next? And I was like, I got this guy Lafayette that I cannot shake. Like, he is everywhere. And I just feel like I need to completely explore him and his life.
Obviously, he was long dead by the time of the Russian Revolution. I believe you're finishing up the Russian Revolution now. Does his name even come up at all in that revolution? Was he ever?
No. So by the time you get to that revolution, what's very interesting about the French Revolution is the impact of the memory of the revolution has on all future revolutionaries. So when you get to the Russian Revolution, all of those guys, Lenin, Kerensky, Trotsky, Stalin, like all of these guys are very well versed in the literal history of the French Revolution and believe to a certain degree that they wanted to follow the course of it. And Lenin was very aware of what Robespierre did and what the Committee of Public Safety did and how he could emulate that. So Lafayette, by this point, is somebody who has been sidelined for having not been revolutionary enough by the sort of guys who were trying to recreate sort of the Jacobin style revolution, although he is quite associated with Alexander Kerensky in terms of like if you're doing a comparison between the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution, Lafayette and Kerensky have a lot in common with each other. So if you're looking for that connection, that's what it is. It's Kerensky and Lafayette.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And I guess this idea of not revolutionary enough would come from the French Revolution, where Lafayette is seen as a supporter of the revolution, but of also maintaining and creating and I'm getting all out of order here chronologically, but still, sort of a supporter of a constitutional monarchy.
Yeah, he believed that states, right, kingdoms, whatever, the people living in a polity deserve to live under a constitutional government, deserved to live under a government that there was like a guaranteed Bill of Rights. There were certain things the state could and could not do to a citizen. There were certain things that citizens were allowed to do that the state couldn't stop them from doing. And this is, the very basic stuff that we in America at least tend to take for granted. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. You should be able to worship whatever God you want without having it affect the taxes that you pay or whether or not your marriage is going to be viewed as legal. So Lafayette believed in all of those things, and they didn't exist in France before the French Revolution. And so he's an active participant in the reform movement that then turns into a revolutionary movement in 1785 to force all of these things onto a very unwilling crown. Once that has happened, once a constitution has been enacted, and there is a thing called the Constitution of 1791 that is sort of the end result of 1789, there's a Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. There are now elections to a legislature, so people are allowed to participate in the crafting of their own laws. Once those things are in place, Lafayette believes that now it's everybody's duty to participate in the legal functioning of that Constitution. And the problem, though, is that many, many people did not think that the Constitution of 1791 was frankly good enough. It was not particularly democratic. It limited suffrage to a very small number of sort of wealthier people. You had to have enough money to actually participate in politics. It was very clear that King Louis and Marie Antoinette were not satisfied with this constitution. They didn't actually want it and were trying to undermine it at every turn. So people were saying, why are we having this constitutional monarchy with a monarch who doesn't even want the Constitution? And so Lafayette was caught trying to defend something that neither the people to his left nor the people to his right actually supported. And so when he's trying to tell people you must follow this Constitution, everybody's like, what, the Constitution none of us actually like? We want something else. And so that's how he, kind of becomes homeless and then is ultimately ejected from the revolution completely.
Is it true up to this day Lafayette is not as revered, say, in France as here in the United States?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. The memory of, I do have a tendency to believe, though, that so Americans have a bit of it, like myself, have a tendency to overrate Lafayette and overrate his importance. Okay. But the French very much underrate his importance. And I think that the fact that we love Lafayette because he was this sort of this bouncy, happy 19-year-old kid who comes over and is he's legitimately a hero of the American War of Independence and of the Continental Army. He's a great friend of the United States. There's no real reason for people in the United States to think anything but great things about Lafayette when his association with the United States is almost nothing but uniformly positive. His record in the French Revolution is far more mixed. And his record in French politics is far more mixed. But there is this tendency for the French to say, and I lived in France for 3 years, so I'm quite aware of this, to say Lafayette wasn't that important, Lafayette wasn't that popular. He was just kind of a nobody. And the thing is, in his life, he was not a nobody. He was a very popular figure. He was a very influential figure. And even at the end of his life, right, when he dies in 1834, there are hundreds of thousands of people that turn out for his funeral, right? There's a funeral procession that runs through Paris that everybody turns out for. Everybody knew that he died. The streets of Paris were legitimately sad that he was gone. And the monarchy at the time, the July monarchy of Louis Philippe, actually staged it as a military funeral specifically because they were afraid that Lafayette's funeral procession would turn into the trigger for a revolutionary uprising to possibly overthrow the July monarchy. So the idea that, he's a big deal in America, but he wasn't a big deal in France. He was a big deal in France for his entire life. His memory has sort of dissipated because neither the right nor the left wants to claim him. And as you move into arguments between Marxist historiography and conservative historiography, they both sides sort of view Lafayette as somebody who's not with them. Lafayette was not with Robespierre and the Jacobins, nor was he with Louis and Marie Antoinette. So nobody wants to defend him. So his memory has sort of fallen away. But I think that underestimates the actual role and popularity that he enjoyed in his own lifetime.
It is my understanding that you went to France, at least in part, to work on this book about Lafayette. It's interesting. I am wildly fascinated in the French Revolution, and I have gone to Paris because I wanted to know more about the French Revolution. There's something about going to a place where the history you're studying that makes it. It probably doesn't make it more real, but at least feels more real.
I think I will validate that. I think it absolutely makes it more real. I think being in the places where things took place creates a meaningful connection to those events. I really do.
And I feel that way too. And I was a little bit surprised. I only went for 10 days, so I was not there for 3 years, and I went alone and without guides, so I could have been looking in all the wrong places. But I was actually surprised how little, at least in Paris itself, that I could find relating back to the French Revolution of 1789.
Yeah, so I lived in Paris for 3 years, and I think that there is some truth to that. It's a little bit like if you've ever gone around London, there's historical markers everywhere. So France and Paris in particular is a city that has so much history, right? So many things have happened in Paris over the years that the French Revolution, while it's obviously a very big deal, and certainly it's not the French cultural memory has forgotten about the French Revolution or doesn't care about the French Revolution. It's still very much a live thing in French politics and in French culture. They're still arguing about it. But if you look at the side of buildings, you will often find things like, oh, and this is where the Jacobin Club was. And you're like, whoa, okay. It's just like a restaurant now. You can go. I know exactly where it is in Paris. Because they tore the building down. But this is where the Jacobin Club was. But they don't carve out that space and make it hallowed ground, right? It's just a restaurant. It's just a square where people hang out. And you do sort of get that a lot. There's not a great deal of, this is where the Declaration of the Rights of Man was signed, right? Or if you go to there's a tennis court, right? There's a famous tennis court oath where they swear, the National Assembly swears that they're going to stay in session and have a constitution for France. You can go to this. You're probably going to be the only person there because it's not highlighted. It's not really in any guidebooks. Nobody says you should go here, but you can absolutely go stand in the spot where they decided to do this. Is just down the street from the palace at Versailles. But so I think the answer to it is that France is a country that is so steeped with so much history. There's so much happening everywhere, but it's also still a living, breathing, vibrant, modern city. It's not just some relic of a bygone age where you go to this place because it's where a lot of historical events happen. You go to Paris for many different things, and history can just be one of them if you want it to be, but they're certainly not going to dwell on it. They're going to tell you about their cafes and the nice clothes and the places where you should go stroll around, and the movie theaters and everything else that's going on in Paris.
The Declaration of the Rights of Man. Lafayette is a co-author of this document. is he just a signatory to it, or did he actually help write it?
Okay, so his relationship with in 1789, the National Assembly comes together, and it very quickly moves from sort of a grand reform project into something that is revolutionary because of the intransigence of the crown, because of the intransigence of the court. They're trying to hold this stuff at bay. They're trying to keep the third estate at bay. The aristocracy doesn't want to share power with all of these rising up and coming like lawyers and doctors and merchants. The aristocracy wants to continue to maintain the power that they've had for literally centuries. So when this revolutionary moment happens and it becomes clear that the National Assembly is now going to move from we're just here to reform taxes in France to we're going to have a constitution, they agreed, pretty much everybody in the room agreed that this document was going to have something like a Bill of Rights attached to it. They already had the model of what was happening in the United States, and that's something that Lafayette was happy to champion. Like in 1789, that's the first year that the U.S. Constitution actually took effect. And so all of those debates had been happening in 1787 and 1788, which people in France, of course, followed. I mean, it's just the stuff that's happening. It's like current events from abroad. What's going on in the new United States? Oh, they're having a constitution, and one of the things they're going to do is have this Bill of Rights. So Lafayette's very connected to James Madison. He's very connected to Thomas Jefferson. And he wants to be the person who's like sort of the first to present what a draft of a Bill of Rights looks like to the National Assembly and have it be a part of the French Constitution. So on July 11th, 1789, he's the first one to stand up and say, this is what I think a draft ought to look like. And he said, I think this should just be the first. I think this is like the rough draft, and then we need to debate what goes in and what should be taken out. But I think that this is kind of like the working draft that we should start from. And pretty much everything in that draft winds up being the sort of officially ratified version of it, which happens like a month and a half later on August 26th. But it's all the stuff. It's freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of conscience, the acknowledgement that at a basic level, all human beings, it says men, right? But all human beings are fundamentally equal and deserving of equal rights and equal treatment, which is all things that Lafayette believed. And so he presents this, and he believes that this is now going to be the thing that sort of drives discourse for at least the rest of that week or for the next couple of weeks. And then 3 days later, Paris erupts not 3 days later, literally the next day, Paris erupts in a popular uprising that leads to the fall of the Bastille on July 14, which sort of pushed Lafayette off the front page.
Interesting. It was always my sense, but I want to know what you think, that the Declaration of the Rights of Man would actually go further than, say, the Bill of Rights in the United States or even the Declaration of Independence. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
I think it combines those two. The Declaration of Independence, at least the preamble to it, is a very expansive declaration, right? It's not, I mean, obviously you keep going in the Declaration of Independence and you're going to get to like, we're mad at the king for this. And like, he wouldn't, clean up his dirty dishes. So we're going to break away. It becomes very specific and kind of very, very whiny, right? If you get down to the bottom of the Declaration of Independence. But at the beginning, Jefferson is writing these very expansive, very universalistic takes of what liberty and equality mean. Whereas the Bill of Rights becomes kind of a legalistic formula for how are we actually going to legislate and how are the courts going to be able to interpret whether laws are just or unjust, or whether or not we can actually legislate on this point or that point. And that's what the Bill of Rights is doing. It's saying Congress can't pass laws that do the following things. It's a guidebook and a rule book for Congress, which is sort of doesn't have that flowery, expansive language that the Declaration of Independence has.
Yeah,
it's the law. Exactly, right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then you get to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the French version of this, and I think it marries those two, because it does make those universalist declarations while also saying, and the legislature won't be able to legislate on this, and this is something that will be a guaranteed right that you can't take away from people. So I think it does both at the same time.
Did Thomas Jefferson play a role at all in the writing of the Declaration of the Rights of Man? I mean, this is a time when Thomas Jefferson is in Paris. He wasn't at the Constitutional Convention in the United States because he was in France.
Yeah, and specifically, him and Lafayette were friends with each other. And so when Lafayette was getting ready to take his draft to the National Assembly, he's sending it to his friend Thomas Jefferson, who he knows is a better writer than he is, and who he knows is probably smarter than he is. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, among his many faults and virtues, was a genius. So he runs it all by Jefferson, and Jefferson gives it a real nice final polish that he's allowed to take. And other French revolutionaries knew Jefferson. He was in and out of that scene. So he helped draft. He helped finish Lafayette's draft. Now, when it gets to the actual final draft as it was finished, there are very smart French guys who are quite happy to write this up themselves. Thank you very much. Like Mirabeau doesn't need an editor. So they took it over from there. Abbé Sieyès was another guy. He was a very famous author himself. He's not running this by Thomas Jefferson before it gets published, but Lafayette did, because Lafayette felt like he needed somebody who could turn a phrase.
The significance of this, and the French Revolution is complex, very complicated.
Boy, that's true.
But this is also kind of where we get the birth, I think. Well, it could be argued. Again, I'd like to know what you think. The birth of modern politics, where we get the terms of left and right when it comes to politics. Also, sort of the beginnings of a modern notion of the citizen comes all through this period of time.
Yeah, and I think the French Revolution is emblematic of something that was happening in many places, right? And it was going to channel ideas that were sort of in the ether. Obviously, these same notions are funneling into, the American Revolution and the American War of Independence. A lot of it was already sort of existent in Britain, where a lot of the French revolutionaries are looking to sort of the rights of Englishmen as something that they wanted for themselves. The modernity of it, and this is the thing, is with the French Revolution being able to sort of mark the beginning of what we would call political modernity, is that all of this stuff consumes the Kingdom of France, of all places, right? The Kingdom of France was the most populous, polity. It was the richest. It was geographically the biggest, aside from like whatever the Russians had going on. I forget exactly what the territorial extent of Russia was at that point, but it is the largest, most influential, most populated kingdom in Europe. And to have it be consumed by these ideas, churn these ideas out, and then have it turn into like wars of expansion and conquest, and then everything that Napoleon was up to, sort of continuing on with pushing a lot of these ideas, even though he was doing it despotically and with guns and bayonets. These ideas wind up getting spread far and wide. And the French Revolution, I mean, we were just talking about this, like you go forward to 1917 and all of those people in the Russian Revolution used the French Revolution as a touchstone. It remained the single biggest political event that occurred in Europe. It's probably still to this day, arguably the most important political event that has ever taken place in Europe in terms of its lasting impact.
And that's why I'm a little surprised by how hard it could be to find some of that physical history and locational history in Paris.
Well, Parisians, what are you going to do? Parisians are Parisians, man. They want to smoke cigarettes and drink coffee. They don't care about the revolution.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Mike Duncan. Mike Duncan is a very popular history podcaster. He produces both the history of Rome, and now he's working on revolutions. He's the author of a couple of books. His latest that we are talking about is called Hero of Two Worlds, the Marquis de Lafayette and the Age of Revolution. Mike Duncan, I had planned to begin this conversation in a chronological order, and of course I screwed that up right at the very beginning, and I'm thinking about that why, and I think one of the reasons why is because I feel like, and this just might be my own interest in the French Revolution, though I'm interested in the American Revolution as well, but I seem to know a lot more about Lafayette when it comes to the to the French Revolution, then I actually do the American Revolution. What did he actually do in the American Revolution?
Well, see, you are a unique case. This is not something I usually encounter. It's usually, well, we know all about what he did in the American War of Independence, and we know his role here. But what happened to him after he went back to France? Like, what happened next? So that's cool. It's usually the other way around. So Lafayette, at a very young age, married into he was an extremely wealthy orphan. Let's just start there. So he was a young noble who both of his parents died when he was a kid, and he inherited a fortune. And because of this, he was a very eligible bachelor. And he marries this woman, Adrienne, who is his wife then for the rest of their lives, who was a daughter of one of the richest and most powerful families in France, the Noailles family. So he marries into this family. And now Lafayette is at the very center of the French monarchy. He's hanging out with Louis and Marie Antoinette, who are at that point not even king and queen yet. They're still just like sort of the heir to the throne, and his wife. And so this is the scene that he's in as a teenager. And it turns out that he's not very comfortable with these people. He doesn't really fit in with that really upper crust, like true blue blood nobility, that scene that was going on in Paris. He didn't quite fit in. And so he became very uncomfortable. He felt awkward. It was noticed that he felt awkward. And so the whole thing was just kind of like not working for him. And, I'm condensing quite a bit of the story here. He winds up not really getting along with his father-in-law either, and decides, once he hears about this revolution that has happened in what is going to become the United States in the British colonies, that they've gone into revolt against the British. Lafayette's looking around at his own life, and he's like, I kind of feel very stifled here. I kind of feel like my life is not going to take off. I kind of feel like I'm just going to be very unhappy if I don't do something drastic to like break free and make my own mark on the world in my own way, in a way that is clearly not working here. So he does. He quite literally runs away from home. They send out a lettre de cachet to try to bring him back. He's only 19 years old. He's not even technically legally an adult yet. But he's rich enough in his own right that he buys his own boat, uses that to sail to the United States, and then is accepted and joins the Continental Army with a commission as a major general. And
is it that easy? You just show up.
Everybody should buy Hero of Two Worlds so they can take that little thumbnail encapsulation. And there's like 2 whole chapters about this. He had gotten a commission from this guy Silas Deane, who was signing up French officers and to go serve in the Continental Army to sort of give a professional tinge to the American officer corps. And Lafayette kind of lied to Silas Deane and said, "Oh no, my family's totally cool with this. Just as long as you make me a general, they'll give me permission to do this." And then he kind of never told anybody that he was doing it. And so what's funny about all of this is the reason that he got this commission as a major general, right, which is a very, very high rank. Like, he's serving directly under George Washington. He's 19 years old. He's some 19-year-old French kid who's suddenly a major general. Like, how does he get this commission? And it's because the leadership of the revolution, George Washington, John Hancock, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin, these guys all knew that the way that they were going to win this war was by securing French support, by bringing the French into alliance with them, by getting the French Navy, the French Army, the French Treasury supporting the British, supporting the rebellion against the British. That's how they were going to win. And so when Lafayette shows up, he's like, I'm from the Noailles family, one of the richest and most important families in France. I literally know Marie Antoinette and the king. Like, I'm not just sort of I'm not just sort of adjacent to them. Like, I know them personally. So he is a very exciting thing to bring into the cause. And so when he shows up, they're like, okay, like, who are you again? And he's like, no, these are all the things about me. Now, what's funny about it, of course, is that none of these people kind of like liked him. He was not actually like on great terms with them, but at least on paper, it looked like he was one of the most well-connected guys in the world. So they brought him in, and it turns out he was a very likable guy. He was a very eager guy. He was a smart guy. Lafayette is, he's not a genius, but he's a really smart guy. And he gets in good with all the Americans. And then by the time he goes back to France, he has earned a reputation for himself in the United States as kind of this like heroic figure, and his reputation changes completely. And by the time he's coming back from fighting in the American War of Independence, he's no longer considered this kind of bumbling, awkward fool. He's considered, this is when they start calling him the hero of two worlds. And he becomes like one of the most popular people in all of France.
So that's what they called him, the hero of two worlds, which is the title of your book.
Héros de deux mondes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How would you characterize, though, his principal contribution to the American Revolutionary War? What was it, to secure French support?
Yeah, I think he's kind of got a minor role and a more major role. His minor role is that he was an active major general in the Continental Army, and he served with distinction. He served well. The things that he was asked to do, he did quite well. And if you were just going to tell like a simple story of how the Continental Army worked, Lafayette's in the middle of it, and I think he makes very positive contributions to how the army functioned and how they went about their campaigning. And then, of course, but the much larger role that he plays is as the principal liaison between France and the United States, between George Washington, who has by now become something of a surrogate father to him, and the Comte de Rochambeau, who Lafayette knew from back when he was just a kid in France. Like Rochambeau knew his family. So he does have these personal connections, and he is able to sort of like, when the French get mad at these rustic colonial farmers who are just kind of like, who have let them down or something, Lafayette is there to soothe feathers. When the Americans there are several points where the Americans get very mad at French conduct, French arrogance, French perfidy, like all this stuff. Lafayette is there to try to smooth things over. And I think he does play a major role in affecting the French alliance and then maintaining it through the rest of the war.
It is interesting to think about the lines from the American Revolutionary War to the French Revolutionary War. And one of those important lines is French support of the American Revolutionary War would help bankrupt France.
Oh, yes.
Which plays, and Lafayette's in the middle of this, which plays a key role in leading to the revolution of 1789. Yeah,
and it is very funny that they shouldn't have done it. Like when you go back to the debates that were being had in sort of the corridors of power in Versailles in 1775 and 1776 and 1777, before they officially signed the alliance, the Minister of Finance is like, dude, we can't afford this. Like our finances are a joke. We have to reform the entire tax base. We already know that. In 1775, there was actually a whole series of bread riots that winds up being called the Flour War, because there were at that moment some very bad harvests. Like the French tax revenue was a pittance of what it should have been, because there's this whole archaic feudal tax structure that specifically exempted the rich nobility from being taxed, right? There were reasons why this makes sense in like 1340, but it no longer made sense in 1775 for the French crown to not be allowed to tax the richest members of the nobility. And then, so their expenses were far exceeding their tax revenue. But people like Lafayette and Foreign Minister Vergennes and Benjamin Franklin managed to convince the king that it would be a very good idea to humble the British, to knock the British down a peg, because they had just lost a war. It all gets very personal with these guys. But to knock the British down a peg, and then American trade would maybe then orient towards France, and France would be able to take advantage of this and become like maybe a hegemon in the New World, and sort of push the British out of the Americas. And that in the long term, this would actually be like good for the finances of France. This is sort of the pitch that was being made in 1775. And it didn't turn out that any of it was true. It was just the French monarchy taking out more loans and more loans and more loans to finance the American Revolution. And then when the bill finally comes due in the mid 1780s, the French monarchy was bankrupt. 10 years later, the French monarchy is completely bankrupt. And it wasn't entirely because they were taking out loans to finance the American War of Independence, but all of that certainly contributed to what happened later, which then Lafayette took advantage of and staged himself another revolution. So he was quite pleased on both ends of it.
I mean, were there conspiracy theorists at the time, questioning Lafayette's role in all of that?
Well,
ever since?
Sure. I mean, he was a Mason. All these guys were Masons. But I think that's all completely overblown. But I don't think that anybody accused Lafayette of sort of like, it's not like, I don't think that there's any story. There's no legitimate interpretation of any of this where it's like Lafayette knew in 1775, hey, on the one hand, I can help my friends in America win independence, and at the same time, I can help bankrupt the French monarchy so that I can stage a revolution. This is just something that happened. When
I think of somebody involved in both the American and French revolutions, Lafayette's one. And the other person I think of is Thomas Paine. Did they ever overlap?
Yeah, sure. Lafayette and Tom Paine knew each other. They intersected both in the United States and in France. They were kind of, by the time that that Paine is coming to France, right? Sort of once he's left the United States, and he goes to England for a while and he writes The Rights of Man. He's much further out on the spectrum than Lafayette is politically. And Paine thinks that Paine is among those who thinks that Lafayette is hewing too conservative, that he's not letting things go far enough, and he's actually becoming something of an agent of reaction and conservatism. So Paine winds up critical of Lafayette, but it just goes to show you like where people can wind up on the spectrum, because then even Tom Paine, who, if you tell the story of the American Revolution, Tom Paine is one of the most stridently radical voices that you're going to find from the very beginning of the American Revolution. There's not many people who are throwing more fire and brimstone in a radical direction than Tom Paine is. He goes back to France. He thinks that Lafayette is not radical enough. Tom Paine himself winds up in a jail cell and is very nearly executed. Why? Because he's too radical? No, because he was hanging out with the Girondins, and he was believed to be himself too moderate. He was hanging out with the wrong crowd when the French Revolution went in an even more extreme direction. And when the people around Robespierre turned on the Girondins, Tom Paine got caught up in that. And very nearly, both Tom Paine and Lafayette were both very nearly guillotined and escaped it. Like, history could have turned 1/1,000,000th of a degree, and both of them could have wound up.
Well, for Tom Paine, wasn't it like the prison door was open?
Literally,
or
the prison.
And you could see the mark?
And the thing is like, I have read a lot of Tom Paine, like his writings. He's actually, like, Tom Paine is one of my favorite writers, just to sort of in general. Like, his prose is so clear and like direct. He's an amazing guy. If anybody wants to be sort of inspired by a writer, Tom Paine's a good guy to follow. But I've never actually sat down and read just a direct biography of Tom Paine. So there is this story that he was in the prison. They would go through, and this is true, they would go through and mark an X on the door of the people who were going to be executed in the morning. And there was an X that was put on his door. And then when the guy came around the next day, the door just happened to be opened. So the guard didn't see that there was an X on the door. Now, that's the story that I know. I don't know if that's actually like literally how it happened, but it's certainly the story I know.
It could be apocryphal.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Lots of these things turn out to be apocryphal. But the other thing,
it's a good story, though.
Yeah, but lots of things that there's been so many times in making the history of Rome and making revolutions and writing these books that I was like, that can't possibly have happened like that. That's apocryphal. And I'll go back and I'll tell the real story. And then I go back and I find out that it was like, nope, that's what happened. Some guy just missed the X on the door. And so Tom Paine got to live. And
you said Lafayette also came close to being executed.
Yeah. Lafayette is, by 1792, Lafayette is a general in the French army, because France declares war on like Prussia and Austria in April of 1792. And Lafayette is one of the three principal generals of the French army at this moment. The war starts to go very badly, very right off the bat for France. And there's a lot of blame being thrown around, and a lot of like, how is this happening? How is France and the revolution being defeated by these stupid old like monarchies that we think we should be able to steamroll? And in the midst of all of this, there is an insurrection in Paris, which is the insurrection of August 10th, which sort of marks the beginning of the next phase of the revolution. This is truly now we're getting to the overthrow of the monarchy and the declaration of a republic. That insurrection was led by people like Danton, and Danton and Lafayette were arch enemies, right? Like, the entire time that Lafayette is commanding the National Guard in Paris in 1789, 1790, 1791, Danton is a populist leader who is constantly criticizing Lafayette, constantly painting Lafayette as an enemy of the revolution. And they did not get along with each other. They kind of hated each other. And so Danton, after the insurrection of August 10th, is now the Minister of Justice in the provisional government after that insurrection. And he signs an arrest warrant for the Marquis de Lafayette to come back and answer for his crimes, specifically Lafayette having overseen a thing called the Massacre of the Champ de Mars in July of 1791. And so Lafayette gets this arrest warrant, very briefly tries to get his army to march on Paris to undo this insurrection, but the army is not going to move. And so he's left with the choice of either I go back to Paris, face these charges, probably get locked up in a jail cell, and then my interpretation of this as a historian is then he winds up getting guillotined. But at some point, there's 3 or 4 different times where they would have hauled him out and chopped his head off. Or he can run across the lines and try to seek. And so he runs. He decides, if I go back, they'll probably kill me. He crosses the line. And he tries to get back to the United States. Honestly, that's his plan, was to escape through what is today Belgium and then hop a ship to the United States. But the Austrians got a hold of him, and the Austrians didn't like him, so they threw him in a dungeon for 5 years, which is its own story.
5
because
years.
this guy has lived an impossibly interesting life.
And now he's in a dungeon for 5 years.
Yeah, he spent 5 years in solitary confinement in a dungeon in what is today the Czech Republic.
Did he ever write a book? Do we have words from him himself?
Yeah, there's plenty of he. There is many volumes of his correspondence, manuscripts, and papers. There's one specifically about everything that has to do with the American Revolution, and then one that his family put together after he died. That's 6 volumes of they just took his papers and published them. Lafayette himself never really wrote an autobiography or a memoir or any great work of literature or any great work of philosophy. And, one of the things that counts against him in terms of him being remembered as a figure, I think part of it does come from the fact that the French expect their great political leaders to write some treatise about something or to write a great memoir. And Lafayette never did that. So we have his own words. There's sort of little autobiographical sketches that he gave, and there's tons of correspondence and speeches that he gave. But there's no proper sort of I, Lafayette, the story of my life, the story of my impossibly convoluted and interesting life.
And then it would be Napoleon Bonaparte who would allow for Lafayette to come back to France. And depending on who you asked, Napoleon was either somebody who solidified the revolution or brought it to
betrayed
an end.
It.
Yeah, or betrayed it. Yeah, exactly.
I wonder what side I'm on. So Lafayette winds up in an Austrian dungeon, and he is there until 1797. And they were, he was probably going to spend the rest of his life there. He was going to die in prison. That much time in dank conditions very much deteriorated his health. He was not in great shape by the end of that. But in 1797, this young Corsican general named Napoleon Bonaparte gets put in charge of the French armies in Italy, and it turns out he's a military genius and starts whipping the Austrians all over the place and wins the Battle of Rivoli in 1797, which basically Napoleon and his armies have a clear road to Vienna. And so the Austrians have to negotiate. They have to. That's it. Napoleon beat them. And between Bonaparte himself, who at this point is still a sort of a young idealistic follower of the revolution, and the government of France, one of the things that they put in the Treaty of Campo Formio is any French prisoners of state that the Austrians, happen to be holding, because it wasn't just Lafayette, you have to release them, with Lafayette being specifically named in that treaty. And so eventually, after some foot dragging, the Austrians had to let him out because Napoleon beat them.
Mike Duncan, we are close to running out of time here, but I did want to ask you about something, and you piqued my interest earlier when you mentioned Lafayette's connection to the Haitian Revolution. And when we're talking about a line being drawn from the American Revolution to the French Revolution, there's another line that can then be drawn from the French Revolution to the Haitian Revolution. But at first, France, after the Declaration of Rights of Man, and it was being debated in France, before the Haitian Revolution was even necessary, they had vowed to end slavery. Napoleon would reverse that. Mm-hmm. How tell me about Lafayette and slavery.
So Lafayette, when he first comes to the United States, does not have a clear. He has sort of very utopian visions of what the United States is, and he comes over. These are freedom-loving people who love liberty and treat each other equally. And so during his run through the American Revolution, he sees that slavery exists, but the wheels aren't quite clicking into place yet. And he's very close with Washington. He's very close with Jefferson, and so he's very well aware that this institution of slavery is in extreme tension with the notions of liberty that they're all supposedly fighting for. After the American Revolution, he goes back to France and the wheels turn some more. And ultimately, it just clicks with him that liberty and slavery are incompatible with each other. And he, in 1783, so as early as 1783, he's still just in his early 20s, he starts writing letters to Washington. He will write letters to Jefferson and Madison telling them, if the American Revolution means anything, and if liberty means anything, we need to work right now. We need to begin the project of emancipating the slaves. Right? This really shouldn't end with slavery still being allowed to be intact as an institution. And this becomes a running theme through his life. He maintains this abolitionist stance, and he maintains sort of at least the private pressure that he is putting on the very influential people that he's personally friends with in the United States, all the way through until his death in 1834. This whole story, however, is complicated by the fact that in his idealism, a couple years later in 1785, he himself purchases a slave plantation in French Guiana and winds up himself owning about 80 slaves, because he wants to prove that if you pay the slaves wages, if you educate them, and if you teach them how to run the plantation for themselves, that you will be able to then free them and let them run the operation as now free citizens instead of slaves. Like, this is what he wanted to do. It was his experiment in emancipation. And the problem is he embarks on this project in 1785 and 1786, just as France is falling into chaos. And by 1789, he's so wrapped up in the French Revolution that he never gets around to freeing the slaves that he had purchased. So in 1789, there's a manifest that the Marquis de Lafayette is still the owner of about 80 enslaved people in French Guiana. And then they don't get emancipated until Lafayette is off in the Austrian dungeon, because the Emancipation Proclamation that comes out of the French Revolution happens in 1794 by the National Convention. Lafayette's been a couple years in prison by that point. So he has, Lafayette. I mean,
is it just though? He was so busy with the French Revolution, he forgot about this, or was he?
No, that's a cheeky way of putting it, I should say. It's not that he just forgot about it. There was a degree to which he was literally so busy as Commander General of the National Guard that sort of what was happening in his financial portfolio, among these things being this slave plantation, La Belle Gabrielle, and some other properties, was not an immediate concern to him. That's very true. And then as events continued to move forward, he is gone by the time that, that those slaves wind up getting freed. So his record is mixed. His North Star through his whole life is that slavery is immoral and unjust and needs to be ended. And then that ties it, like you say, that ties him back into the Haitian Revolution, because again, he gets ejected from the French Revolution. He winds up in a prison. This is all while the Haitian Revolution is going on. After the Haitian Revolution comes back, and as you said, Napoleon Bonaparte reinstitutes the slavery that had been abolished in 1794. Lafayette is very much opposed to that. He thinks that was a horrible decision. And when the Haitians do secure their freedom and independence from France, Lafayette is a voice eventually inside the government, or not inside the government, but inside the Chamber of Deputies, arguing that France needs to recognize free and independent Haiti, both the Kingdom of Haiti and the Republic of Haiti, because there were two units that sort of emerged from the Haitian Revolution. So he was very much in favor of a full recognition of Haiti, and this sort of the now infamous indemnity that the French government placed on Haiti, saying, we will recognize you if you give us all of this money to like pay us back for the fact that you were our slaves and now you aren't. Like this horrible, horrible thing. And by the way, France should give them that money back. You know, if I can editorialize here.
It's a legacy that we still see today.
Hey, Macron, why don't you sign a check and give it to the Haitians, man? But anyway,
it's a legacy that we could still see today.
Absolutely. We still see it today. And but Lafayette was in correspondence with, for example, President Boyer of Haiti, and was known as an abolitionist. They knew him as an abolitionist, and he supported them and tried to convince his countrymen to also support the Haitians.
Mike Duncan, I regret we weren't able to get to the 1830s, but that's a good reason to.
That's all right. People can read the book.
That's right. Mike Duncan has been our guest again. Mike Duncan is a popular history podcaster. He has the podcasts of The History of Rome and Revolutions. He's also the author of a couple of books. His latest, just out, that he's joined us to talk about, is called Hero of Two Worlds, The Marquis de Lafayette in the Age of Revolution. Mike Duncan, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
I enjoyed our conversation very much too, and I thank you.